You are listening to the Baobab Project. Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us under the Baobab tree from wherever you are in the world today. We are joining you from Halifax, Nova Scotia. We've got so much to explore, from culture to lifestyle to health, relationships, education, and so much more. Now over to our podcast host for today.
Welcome, everyone, and I want to welcome you under the Baobab tree as we start this next podcast. Today I have with me Dr. Susan Brigham and Martin Morrison. They are going to join me as we discuss this podcast. I know this is a very difficult one to explore, but it is something that we do need to talk about: racism. So our topic today is, excuse me, is this racist? And for those who are listening to us today, my name is Randy Headley, and I'm your host. We also have a few guests sitting in and listening to our discussion, and they're free to ask questions and to participate in the discussion. We want to have a smooth flow today as we talk about a topic that really affects not only us on campus, but our entire community. I'll begin the questions by asking Dr. Brigham. I'll call you Susie throughout this discussion, if you don't mind. I'll ask you to start by explaining what constitutes racism.
Okay, thank you for the question. I would probably first need to just highlight what race is before we define racism. So, race is a socially constructed term. It's a concept that some people have used to attribute biological or physical differences to groups of people. And of course, there is no biological basis to this idea of race, but we have over time, historically, socially, politically, we have attributed different, visible characteristics, phenotypical features, for example, or hair types, and skin color. We've attributed those to differentiate different groups. And over time, that's kind of been arbitrarily assigned because we've had people who have been decidedly been told, you are Black. And then over time, they may say, you know what, I'm actually not. I am white, or I'm a different, I identify myself differently. So I think it's important to think about how those basis of distinguishing people is not set in any biological meaningfulness, because it has changed based on politics and based on how we socially construct one another. And so, having defined race, I would then go to say that racism is how we have used these ideas, these socially constructed ideas of race, how we've used them to policies or practices, and then we've used those policies and practices to ensure that there's racial inequities. So various groups of people are not being treated equally or equitably because of this so-called artificial designation of difference.
Artificial designation of difference. That is an awesome. That's a phrase or a term that I think we can afford to explore. Martin, would you pick up from that, and also help us to dig into this term racism a little further?
I think just to kind of extend on that, the commentary around the artificial component attached to this is that we have to introduce the concept of power, or the notion of power, as it relates to those distinctions. And so if you're looking at, colonial imperialistic ideas, and the idea that there's a hierarchy attached to, different racial groups based on biological components that are not rooted in any kind of inherent superiority, I guess, from one group to another,
Yeah.
is that you know that the influence of power creates a situation whereby that if you are in a designated racialized group that is not part of the dominant group, then you're isolated and you can be marginalized and you can be pushed to the side. And I think that the challenge, one of the deep challenges I think with racism, when I was thinking about the question before we came, is the fact of who gets to define or determine what racism is. And so
Yeah.
if you're treated differently as a racialized person, as a person of African ancestry in Nova Scotia, and it's not an explicit expression of a derogatory comment or whatever, you have to filter through, if you've had those experiences, you have to filter through what constitutes racism. And it's a challenge in a sense that a person of African ancestry would have to, consider the fact that differential treatment or mistreatment could be rooted in a racialized identity. But the struggle is to try to determine whether that's actually true if there isn't a signifier to that. So if it's not attached to something. So, I in my experience as a teacher, I've saw many students struggle with differential treatment and not being certain in terms of does that differential treatment constitute racism based on.
So hold that point. We will get back to the signifiers a little bit later. That's a very good point that we do need to touch on, and it's very important as well to understanding racism in a contextual manner. So what I'm gathering here for our listeners is that racism doesn't exist if race is excluded, and race exists only as a social construct. So if we deconstruct race, then racism will be out the door. Is that what we're saying?
If we stop attributing meaning to these superficial, artificial differences, then we can let racism go out the door. But I don't know when that'll happen or if it's happening.
Well, we're sitting in this room, and it is our desire, each and every one of us, it is our desire to see racism out the door. And I think it's a very good start. But while we aspire and dream and think of racism as one being no longer in existence, we still have to deal with it, because as soon as we leave these doors, there is that possibility that you will instantly encounter a situation where you are discriminated because of your race. And it exists in so many forms. Martin, can you help us to examine some of those terms and that are used to describe racism, and not necessarily in words, it could be in other forms as well. When someone says I've been racially discriminated against and they provide a term or a situation, what do they say or what do they show?
I don't necessarily know that I have a specific kind of use of terminology with respect to those kind of questions. But say, for example, when I was referring to differential treatment, there are things attached to racialized experience. Say, for example, if you go to a store and you're having an exchange with the clerk at the counter, and you pass them money and they exchange your money, and instead of placing it in your hand, they place it on the table.
Yeah.
And so, you would scoop your money up and put it in your pocket, and you see the next customer come in who doesn't live a racialized experience, and that exchange is different from yours. And so, that while there's no kind of evidence except for your anecdotal kind of witnessing of differential treatment, you are forced as a racialized person to consider that maybe that differential treatment is rooted in racism. And the challenge psychologically is that because you can't determine that, it's something that you learn that the criteria or the burden of evidence as it relates to a racialized incident is out of your control in some instances.
Yeah. Now, I just remember a situation as well, riding on the bus, and an older white woman said, she just looked at me and my girlfriend then, and she said, if this was this were the 60s, you would have been sitting at the back of the bus. Right. And I just said, well, I'm glad it's not the 60s, and I hope that you get into the 1920s.
Yeah.
Or no, not 19,
2000.
2000, sorry. Yes. So I asked that and hope that she get up to time with what's happening and stop living in the past. So sometimes it can be very explicit. People can be very explicit in telling you what's on their minds or what they have learned over time. Because remember, this is a social construct we're dealing with. So, Susie, can you help us to determine where do people construct, or how do they learn to be racist? Where are some of the places? Because I know people say you are born a racist. Some people will say you're born being racist, but or they'll look at a family and say that family is racist, or they'll look at a people and say those people are racist. Is that so? Can you be born a racist, or do you think that you have to learn how to be? And how are you taught to construct these attributes?
Right. I would say you can't be born racist
Okay.
because it is, as I say, a socially constructed idea. So through social interactions and through socialization, as you grow and age, you learn how people are being treated differently. And so you may learn that in family, you may learn it in community, you may learn it in your church or your faith groups, you may learn it in schools and universities. So it's historically entrenched, and so a lot of people have a hard time letting it go.
Yeah.
And some people will say, well, I'm not racist. I've let that go. I know now. I'm totally aware of myself. And yet you still see them acting racist, or they are saying racist things.
Yeah.
And they're not aware that they are being racist. So I think, again, it's the ideology of racism. And as Martin had said, it's the power that permeates our way of interacting with one another, that we sort of normalize it. And to me, that is the issue, is how do we get past these ideas of normalization, this idea that this is the way to be, even though, you may be feeling like you're quite beyond racism and that you've become very much conscious. It is an ongoing challenge. And I ask myself, like, did I ever, when is it, like, sometime I'm driving and maybe someone cuts me off, instantly I might be thinking, okay, that must be a white man. And then I'll catch myself and think, oh my God, why did I do that? Why did I make an assumption about that driver? And I didn't even see who the driver was. Or, keeping with the car example, I did have someone cut me off, and it was a Chinese woman, a woman of Chinese descent. And I didn't feel anger to her. I was like, oh, okay, fine. So in my own self, I need to continually reflect on, am I making assumptions about people? Because that's part of this idea, is stereotyping people, making assumptions about people. And, even going there before you even see the person. Are you instantly assuming something about a person that's socially constructed, whether it's their age or their color or their race?
Yeah. So anyone can help me deconstruct this piece, because Susie, you've made some very valid points there, and it just caused me to create another question for us. When we think of race and constructing racism, doesn't that in effect says that there must be some amount of power attached to a group of people to be able to say, this is what we will accept as norm, and anyone else outside of this group, we will treat them this way because they're not in our group. And is that one of the qualities of, can we say quality of racism, or qualities of racist? How do we say that? Characteristics, yeah. Is there not power attached to it? And can someone from a minority group, and I'm air quoting minority group here, can a minority group then become be seen as a racist, as we would say someone from the dominant group would be?
No, I'll guess I'll chime in. Yeah, I think that, power is the central component to me as it relates to racism because it enables you to act on your socially constructed perceptions of the other. And
Yeah.
so, if I am a police officer, for example, and I have a racist idea about someone, I can utilize my authority as a police officer to engage in a way where I'm demonstrating my power through this interaction with the individual that I'm pulling over.
Mm-hmm.
I think that, and this is how I've understood it, and I could, stand to be corrected, but I think, folks who are in marginalized groups or racialized groups, who have maybe negative perspectives of other people based on their racial identity, I think are bigoted, in the sense that they might have, their perspectives might be problematic, but I think minus the influence of power and authority, it's hard to determine whether they can be racist because, it's one of those things that, I'm sure in certain ways, in certain circumstances, there are positions of power that it might be relevant, but
Yeah.
it's a question of degrees of power and,
Okay.
and influence. So
Yeah. Can you add to that?
I just wanted to add about this idea of power and racism. So I've heard this term, and probably others have, about internalized racism.
Mm.
So there are socially constructed ideas of status, prestige, and authority, as Martin said, and somehow they seep into all of us in our society, and we may not buy into it. We may say, okay, I totally eschew that, I ignore that, I don't agree with it. But there are some things that turn up in your own psyche, or you see people say things and you don't challenge it because maybe in your own mind you're thinking, oh, okay, well, yeah, that could be true, And I think one of the big points I would like to make is how race is not something we can separate out from sexism, classism,
Mm.
homophobia. So there's so many other forms of oppression, and they together work in sync with one another so that we are continually challenging not just the social constructed notion of difference, but we're actually challenging material
Mm.
outcomes. So you may have someone who's white and in poverty.
Mm.
They may still feel that they have more power over a black person with money.
Yeah.
Because they feel like their skin color is giving them power.
Mm.
And it often does.
Mm.
I mean, we know this. We see many examples of, well-off Black people being treated very badly in a way that a white poor person wouldn't be. So I'm just raising the point about how we need to look at the complexities of oppressions and how they do intersect.
Yeah, absolutely. Just a reminder, guests, we're here today on the Baobab Tree. I'm your host, and I'm with Dr. Susie Brigham and Martin Morrison. And we are exploring what racism looks like. Our topic is, excuse me, is this racist? And, I think many of you who are listening are wondering when we're going to get to that point where someone will ask the question, is this racist or is that racist? Hang in there. We want you to get the entire picture of what racism looks like. And it began from the idea of deconstructing racism, narrowing it down to the definition of what race looks like, and then we'll end up answering your question of whether something is racist or not. Maybe you'll answer that question before we get to the end. But under the Baobab Tree, we will have the discussion and allow you to either accept what we've discussed and from comment. You raise that part for me, and I will start back from there. Yes, on the Baobab Tree, I guess it is a place where you will hear what we have to share and think for yourself. Determine if this is something that happened in your life, and if this is something the information you can use to make changes in your life. I have another question for our panel, and I'll ask Martin this one first. Is for you to explain. Could you please explain for us what the difference is between racism and aggressions and the forms of aggressions as we know in society?
Could you be a little bit more specific in terms of the aggressions versus racism?
Yeah. For instance, you are coming from a Black community, predominantly Black community, and if someone calls you by a name which might be derogatory in another context, like say, for instance, an international student can be called Black boy in their own country,
Mm-hmm.
but in Canada, they cannot be called that same name because of one reason or the other. So maybe that will be constituted as racism.
Yes.
But then there are other forms of aggression, macro aggressions that
Yes.
we can identify as well. They aren't necessarily racist.
Yes. So no, I'm capturing what you're saying now. For me, it's you have to explore the context, and so being African Nova Scotian, and going back to my initial point around the psychological challenge of differential treatment, problematic treatment towards you as a person of African ancestry without an explicit identifier. And so when I talk about power, the people who often have the ability to determine whether someone's racist institutionally are normally people of European ancestry.
Mm.
And so, you have these kind of interactions with folks that are not necessarily specifically connected to a signifier or characteristic derogatory term. And so that's a question that kind of floats there for you as a person of
Yeah.
African descent in this context. When you get something that might be understood as an aggressive comment like, hey, boy, what are you doing here? Or something to that effect.
Mhm.
I think as a racialized person in Nova Scotia, that's enough of a connection for you to be able to suggest that that comment is rooted in racism. And I think the way that you react to that is to say that these things adding up in terms of an unwarranted kind of comment to you as a person who's just walking the street, and its connection to your racialized identity in this context is enough to say, why did you need to put those two things together? If you were, yelling to me as a person of, just because you want to get my attention, why did you have to use the signifier of race?
Yeah.
And so I think
Yeah.
that there's a hypersensitivity and hypervisualness in terms of being a minority, and that I know that term's problematic, but being a marginalized individual in a situation where you're not reflective of the dominant culture, that creates a situation whereby you feel that is evidence enough to be able to respond to it in a way that it's connected to your racial identity more so than any personal piece.
Yeah. So I'll just throw it here for the audience, and you can just answer this one question. Have you ever had the question, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Have you ever heard that? And how did you react?
I'm really good at accents. So this was fairly recent. I walked to Lacewood, which is 50 minutes from MSVU, and I met this lady and she was complimenting my hair and I said thank you. Then she's asked me, well, where are you from? So I'm like, oh, I'm from England actually. Because I do a really good British accent. She's like, no, where are you really from? I said, I was born there. That's where I'm from. You want to see my passport? And then I laughed to myself because I'm like, well, why is she asking me this? It's not fun, it's not fair, but at least I had fun with it.
It was a white person.
Yeah. Elderly.
Yeah. Yeah. Anyone else have you ever had those kinds of questions?
All the time. Yeah. When I was a doctoral student in Alberta, I remember many times people would say, well, where are you from? In fact, growing up, it was always the same.
Yeah.
And it really depended on who was asking. And were they really interested? Maybe they were also a similar color or shade as me, and maybe they wanted to see if we're kindred spirits or we have some connection. So it did depend on who was asking me and how persistent they were. If they kept saying, no, where are you really from? And then they basically wanted to know my heritage. They wanted to know my race. They wanted to know my biology. They wanted to know, it's too much. They wanted to know too much.
Yeah.
So I did feel that was going too far.
Yeah.
I wasn't curious about him, but he was curious about me. And if I gave an answer, that should be sufficient.
Yeah, absolutely.
No, I normally get that question, but I figure it must be my accent. So not really. Normally I tell them my country of origin, right? Because I figure they're asking me the question. And you mentioned something earlier, Randy, that depending on where you're from, you may not see racism, or you're not able to see racism in Canada, for example, if you grew up in a Black majority country, which I did. And so when someone asks me, immediately I don't think, oh, it's because, of race or anything like that. I immediately think it must be my accent, or, and so I normally answer where I'm from, right? Where I was born and so on. So, yes, it is different depending on who's asking.
Yeah.
And
also if it's like, I don't know if easy is the right thing to say, but for you, it's easy to say Jamaica.
Yeah.
Because you're quite recently from Jamaica.
That's right.
It's more complicated when you are, for example, African Nova Scotian, and your people have been here for 300 years.
Yeah. That's right.
And you are asked, where are you from? No, where are you really from? Where are you from? And it's like you can answer and answer and answer, and they are not satisfied because they may be much more recently immigrating to this country and still feel like they belong in a way that you can't possibly, because you are of a different color. So I think in combination with, and the same with me, like it's so complex. If someone wants to know that, I gotta go into where my mother came from, where my father came from, and how long it was since they immigrated. It's just such a long, complicated answer. So, and my accent is not different enough to warrant people to say, oh, you can't be from here. But maybe the skin color is enough to say you can't be from here. So it's about a sense of belonging and a sense of othering. And
I'll throw some more aggressions out there. Your accent was really good. You sound like a Canadian. Yes, right. And have you ever heard this other one? Why did you leave such a warm country to come to this cold place? When are you going back? Right. So I just wanted us to talk about some of those aggressions. Are there any others that you want to throw out there?
I like that one. I'm fresh out of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. We have, if it's not sunny, it's raining. And I'm not accustomed to 19-degree weather last night. I have so much experiences. Last night, I was outside of my dorm with my friends. One is Canadian and one is an Indigenous Canadian. And we were talking and I was shivering. I'm wearing joggers, I'm wearing a sweater, and I'm shivering and my teeth are chattering. And they're just in shorts and a t-shirt and they're just chilling, literally. And I'm freezing and they're like, Brianna, how are you cold? And then the other one, the Canadian girl, she goes, all right, she's from the Caribbean. It's so hot down there. When are you going back? Do you think you'd go for winter? It's like basically that type of thing. It's like, I get that quite a bit, but at the same time, it's like, okay, I've come to a different climate, but at the same time, you don't have to remind me where I come from is warm. I know it's warm, but I'm here now. It's confusing, it's irritating, but I guess you just have to answer them.
Yeah, it's just the assumptions, right?
Yeah,
You mustn't be.
I mean, if they want to pay my ticket to go back, I would gladly take it.
It's like, like Randy has immigrated here. And so if someone came up to Randy and said, when are you going back home? We'd be like, well, this is home.
Yeah.
So who are you to suggest that I should go back? Like, back where? I'm here, I'm home. So that's the irritation, is the assumptions again behind those questions.
It's a perpetual interrogation of your ability to belong somewhere.
Yes.
So if you're multi-generational here, and to be challenged on that, it's in one way it's a reminder that
You don't belong.
It's not
you
your
don't
place.
belong, right? That there's a dominant perspective or default perspective of who belongs and who doesn't. And when you're challenged about that and you have to justify kind of your belonging here, I think in some cases it can be innocent, but also it's a way to unsettle you. It's a way to make you feel not grounded in ever being accepted fully, and you get those microaggressions
Yeah.
on the regular.
I would love to play this part of the podcast for my friends because they have consistently asked me, well, why are you here? And I keep saying, for school, for an education, that there aren't any universities on my island. So I came to seek a better future for myself, it's an opportunity. And they consistently ask, if it's so cold, why are you here? I'm not here for the cold, I'm for school. So just let me be.
Yeah.
And then they could flip that to suggest like, oh, well, you're taking advantage of what we have to offer,
Oh.
and then it's those types of extensions of that unsettling component of lack of entitlement or lack of
I would take it further to say if it wasn't for colonialization or if it wasn't for the experiences that have caused my country to not be as developed as yours, then I would not have to come here. In a way, this is me reaping the benefits of what happened many years ago. Someone before me set the path, set the road for me to be able to walk. I would not be here if it wasn't for the sacrifice of another. So me being here is not even a sense of belonging or a sense of entitlement. It's me taking advantage of what was fought for on my behalf.
Right.
So you shouldn't have to question that.
Yeah, and I'm wondering if that interrogation, that perpetual unsettling of your ability or our ability to belong in a place, if our education system, say for example, gave context to the fact that the advantage of the Western world was as a result of the exploitation of the continent of Africa,
Right.
And enslavement and those types of things. And so, when we're trying to, be kind to people who are asking us questions, without necessarily the understanding that's required to give context to marginalization, vulnerability, colonialism, exploitation of resources and exclusionary practices to vulnerable countries. Those are the things that I think if our education system did a better job at responding to, that the default perspective wouldn't be that this country belongs to only people of European ancestry. So,
Can I just jump in? I wanted to jump in about this. Oh, it must be, you've left a warm country. I bet you want to go back because it's really cold here. Those ideas have been entrenched in immigration policy. So before 1967, the immigration policy of Canada deliberately kept out folks who were Black. And the reasoning is because they wouldn't be able to handle the cold. So there's a patronizing assumption amongst those in power to say those Black folks can't come here because they won't be able to handle the cold. So I just wanted to say again, there's something important for us to think about when people are assuming you can't handle the cold and oh, too bad you left somewhere hot. There's a whole heap of discriminatory, historical, racist policy behind that idea.
That's will lead exactly into my next question. I have some adjectives, and there are many adjectives that are used before the word racism that we often don't capture what it really means. So maybe if you can, I have 3 on my list, but if you can further explore others, so the audience can have a better sense of what these adjectives means, that would be good. Susie, can I start with you? And maybe you can take on systemic and institutionalized racism to help the audience understand what these mean and what do they look like.
Okay, great. Thank you for that question. So we had talked about what is racism, and we talked about how that could be policies and it could be practices that lead to inequities among and to support racist ideas.
Yeah.
So this idea of something that's systemic, it's in a system. And I think it's very, very helpful to think about systemic racism because often people will, take a liberal approach to racism and they'll say, well, I personally am not racist and I personally feel this way or that way. And by individualizing this idea of race, we can easily say, only Nazis or white supremacists are racist.
Mm-hmm.
And I couldn't possibly be racist because I'm not a white supremacist, I'm not a skinhead or whatever. And so that is a way out for a lot of people, to find a way out of being recognized as racist. They'll say, I'm not that extreme. And so racism can show up in policies, and it can show up in practices, and it can show up in institutions where those policies and practices allow for racism and in fact perpetuate racism. And we talked about ideology and a way of normalizing racism. That's part of the issue with systemic and institutionalized racism, is it's become so normalized that people can't actually see it for what it is,
Mm-hmm.
or they will, resort to things like, oh, it's always been that way.
Yeah.
That's the way we've always done it. It's not racist. It's just the way that we do things here. I've heard people explain away racism by those very sort of superficial go-to responses. It's not racist. It's just the way it is.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah.
Yeah. Would you have an example? Maybe we can come back to an example afterwards to share on to help us understand what systemic racism looks like. You gave a very good explanation and definition there, but is there an example that we can point to say, yeah, this is one that everyone knows, but doesn't even recognize it anymore?
Right. I would say when you're living in a multicultural society like Canada, that you go to an institution or a business or what have you, and the majority or almost exclusively the folks there who are making powerful decisions are white.
Mm-hmm.
That to me is an institutionalized racism. There's something happening in that institutional organization that's not allowing others, like Black folks, for example, to find their way in, to find their way into powerful decision-making positions. And that to me is institutionalized racism. And also, if you walk on a campus, for example, and every building usually is given a name to some benefactor or something. If you can look at all the building names and they're pretty much exclusively named after white folks, that's a problem.
Yeah.
That to me is
good example.
It's an example of an aggression.
I think like when, if you look back, and so people will say, oh, racism was something that happened a while ago.
Yeah.
Right. It's not relevant now. And if you look at the application of racist policies, practices, and procedures, right, like Jim Crow, like segregation,
Mm-hmm.
like disproportional funding to white organizations and institutions versus Black organizations, as a foundational piece to demonstrate the disproportionality in terms of access to opportunities, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you see how that things like redlining and access and denial of loans to particular communities. And so those origins of racism that were very explicit at the time frame, that as you fast forward and people have benefited from it,
Mm-hmm.
and it becomes normalized in those institutions, that it's understood as that's the norm. And so there's almost a perception of white entitlement, that because white people from this particular point in time have always accessed and occupied those spaces, that when you do kind of what Dr. Brigham's suggesting of interrupt that mind frame, you're understood as doing something that isn't right or isn't fair.
Mm-hmm.
And I think in terms of kind of contextualizing the disproportional representation of Black people pretty much everywhere, whether it was the police force or teaching or judicial system, we have to start at that place to really fully understand why things are the way they are. And I think what happens is that isn't captured for society, and so you have the perception that any action to respond to that, like affirmative action pieces or equity efforts,
Mm-hmm.
they're understood as being problematic and not the systemic racism. So we're looking at the reaction to the issue, but not what created the issue.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
I think that's a big component in terms of the complacency of a lot of people around not actively responding to the results of racism and systemic racism over periods of time.
Yeah. So either of you can just touch on anti-Black racism. What does that really mean? What does it look like?
I think for me, anti-black racism is it's a relatively new term.
Yeah.
To my mind, it comes out of the the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think it's the specifics of racism or anti-racism that is connected to experiences of Black people, of people of African ancestry. And so, I think that in terms of the specific reference of anti-Black racism, it creates a space to have dialogue about the manifestations of racism as it relates to the experiences of Black people over time.
Mm.
And so to think that people of African ancestry were exploited to the extent that they were understood as property, not even as people, like, no different than a rake, for example. Like you
Yeah.
could be owned and traded and to recognize and acknowledge that is the place that we're coming from in terms of understanding the experiences of Black people. It gives you a specific context in terms of how we continue to be located in the conversation
Yeah.
about
Yeah.
racism,
Yeah.
as opposed to the different manifestations of racism and how they're applied to different groups. So yeah.
Yeah. So you mentioned earlier, Martin, that, and I'm not going to paraphrase. I'm just going to try to contextualize what you just said. Um, we here in Canada are nice people. We're not like the folks in the US who were explicitly racist, right? So it makes it quite difficult. And I think at some point in my life as well, I said, if a country doesn't like me, I'm not even visiting there. So I had this aversion to even touching the soil of the US because, they were explicitly racist. And my Canadian friends said, Canada is a nice country. We're not racist here. Those folks got the Jim Crow law, they got the KKK, they got everything happening there, they got the police force, and we are nice. So those kinds of examples and attitudes and experiences have spilled over to Canada in recent years, where you can't see that difference between the experiences of people, Black folks in America, and the experiences of Black folks in Canada. Um, so I want us to capture and understand, to help our audience to understand what are some of the signs of racism, right? Like I said earlier, Canadians are nice. So we really need to dig deep into this discussion now to explore some of those signs because it's not easily seen. We can see an American and say, "Yep, that's a racist. He's got the KKK sign on his arm, or
Right.
or he's flying the Confederate flag."
Right.
Help us to understand what racism looks like in Canada.
I think for me, that racism becomes kind of more overt as it relates to the sense of threat that the dominant culture feels, right? And so when I was referring earlier to kind of white entitlement, I think that as people of African descent advocate for their rights and assert their belonging to a place based on charter of rights, et cetera, that that threat, you'll start to get more overt expressions of resistance towards those components. And in Canada, it seems to be one of those things where, because of the more recent reputation of multiculturalism and having charter of rights and being kind of understood globally as a place that welcomes diversity and difference, that the challenge in terms of calling out those expressions of racism are a little bit more problematic, a little bit more challenging because the odds are stacked against you. So, if groups of people have experiences with racialization and marginalization, and there's a mechanism politically that's saying, no, we welcome, refugees, and we have a long history stemming back to the 60s, and nobody really understands what happened prior to the 60s in terms of racialized, oppression and experiences, then that is the baseline that people start. And so it creates a challenge in terms of of trying to speak truth to power when the disproportional elements of power are so strong that you're almost drowned out.
Yeah. Okay, so Susie, I can ask you to jump in there and help us to understand what are some of the signs of racism.
Right. Okay. So I think part of the issue of what you were explaining there is historical amnesia. And I think that comes through a deliberate ignorance of history in
Yep.
Canada. So
Yep.
people are often like comparing us, well, we're not as bad as the United States, therefore we are better than the United States. And that is hugely problematic. We've had, lots of archival evidence that racism was alive and well in terms of a slavery program here in this province and in Canada in general. So I know a lot of people, they just say, no, 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 we don't want to talk about that dark, dark history, that bad, bad thing. Let's move on and talk about the nice things, how we support refugees and how we are actively have a multicultural policy. So people are often deliberately trying to willfully ignore what happened historically, which allows us to separate where we are presently, because in the present day, it obviously connects to the past. And Martin has made several examples of that, like how these over generations have sustained and continued a racist ideology in the year 2021. So again, we look at what policies are in place. And then, of course, people will say, well, we don't actually have a racist policy. But then we look at the practices. What are the practices and what are the things that people are allowing to happen that's deliberately racist or white supremacist? And you're going to see that through listening to the voices of people who are experiencing this.
Yes.
And again, I think that's part of the silencing of those perspectives. And there's a deliberate, I'd say it's a deliberate decision to say, we don't really want to hear your story. Or that's a really nice story, but that's just your personal story. It's not a story of Canada. So we'll keep that in its little place and let's keep talking about the good stuff.
Yeah.
And so again, this idea of silencing the counter story is really a problem, and it continues to allow racist practices to sustain themselves.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
And if I could,
Go ahead.
I think like the work of institutions. It's already been done in terms of creating a situation where the default is that it's understood that Canada has this reputation. So, like I was trying to say before, it's in responding to that. It's like you have to punch above your weight to be heard, to be understood in terms of things that are problematic or things that are kind of overtly racist. And I think there's a difference between the policies that an organization, will put forward as this is how we choose to operate, and the actual practices that take place internally in organizations. And so, you might have a bureaucracy who takes comfort in that, well, this is traditionally how we've always done things that have worked in the interest of supporting that status quo and that repetition of, the inequities that exist. And without the willingness to navigate and monitor those institutional bureaucratic components, you're not actually like hearing what folks need. And I read a tweet just before coming in about, and it was from Reverend Leonard Anderson, who said something about and hopefully I'll get it right, but he said something to the effect of like, be wary of organizations who celebrate your presence, but not your perspective. And so in one instance, people want that representation as a demonstration of their commitment to equity, say, for example. But when you occupy that space, you really try to push beyond their comfort level around what it is that needs to change to make you fully whole and invited in that space, then you've crossed the line. And that messaging is pretty clear back to you that, we want you here, but we have a problem with where you're trying to take us. And, I think that's one of those things where, we have to figure out.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm going to jump into this next portion because, we talked a lot about what racism looks like. We provide a definition. We talk about some of the names and all that goes with it. But if we sit and do nothing, I think earlier we talked about wanting to see change. Right. So let's jump into that right now about some actions. So we will, in this room, attempt to combat racism. And so I will draw from your expert knowledge to help us to understand what are some of the tools you would use, and who is responsible. Maybe I'll start with that question. Who is responsible for combating racism? Susie, can you take that one?
Yes, everyone.
That was too easy.
Everyone is responsible, and I think the hard work often is for those at the top, those in positions of power, authority. They have prestige that was unearned, and yet they continue to hold on to it so tightly that they're reluctant to let it go. So those in power, like for example, a premier of a province or prime minister of a country or a leader of an organization, a CEO, they are in places where they could make difference, but they're going to just ever so tightly hold on to it and maybe dole out a little bit of this and a little bit of that. Like, oh, well, you know what? We're going to bring in a couple of Black folks, and we'll then say we are very multicultural, we're very welcoming of Black folks.
Yeah.
And that's a very, again, a very superficial, tokenistic way of trying to prove that they are not racist. So if you see that, you need to then ask, okay, so you've got these two Black folks, quite visibly positioned in your bank or in your store. So now what have you done in terms of making equitable policies? What are your practices? How have they changed? And the key thing for me is, who are you listening to? If you are white and in positions of power, are you listening to folks who are not like you? Are you friends with, genuinely friends with folks from the Black community, for example? Do you have them over to dinner? Do you go out and play golf or interact with folks that are not the same as you on a regular basis? And that's one thing, but it's always down to practices and policies. What is it that's maintaining these inequities? And then you've got to understand that there are inequities.
Yes.
Because a lot of people will say, we don't have that problem. We are completely equitable here. We treat everybody the same. And that, to me, sets alarm bells, because to treat everyone the same is a liberal notion. There, as we've been talking historically, there's been wrongs done to whole groups of people, and to say, okay, well, you're the same as me, is a very dismissive way of ignoring the inequities, whether they're economic inequities or racial inequities. It's an easy way to say, oh no, we are all the same.
Yeah.
And so I would say challenge that.
That's a good point. It's like we're all the same. You gave us the same bucket to go fetch, to carry water, but one bucket has a whole, and by the time we get back to our destination, one has less water than the other.
Right.
Right. So I think that's a good point. Equity and equality, and these are some of the ideas and words that come up that you've mentioned that we can use to combat racism. But do you have any? Yeah, sure, absolutely.
Not only, I said this in my class earlier, a social policy class, where we're talking about women being able to have their voice input in implementing policies and what's not. But it's not only even about being equal or having that sort of equity. It's also about respect, because you could be in a position where it's two people working in the same position. One is Black, one is white, but one still has more respect than the other. So we may have the same pay, we may have the same job, but at the same time, you have more respect than I could. Even if I work as much as I can, as best as I can, I would not be able to earn that. So it's not even about being equal. It's also about getting to that level of respect where you can look at someone, you see that they're a Black person, you acknowledge that they're hardworking. You don't give them a prize just because, like you said, tokenism. You don't reward them because you want to look good. You do it because they earn that respect and they earned whatever they have worked for.
Yeah. So Martin, you mentioned advocacy earlier, and combating racism. How do we include that part? How do we include advocacy as a tool to combat racism?
I think I'll just go back to the previous conversation, because the best way that someone explained the difference between equality and equity was that equality means that everybody has a pair of shoes. Equity means that everybody has a pair of shoes that fit. And so equity is about an effort to actually resolve circumstances where sameness doesn't actually meet those expectations.
Yeah.
And so I think when it comes to advocacy, I think that knowledge is power in the sense that there's the current power dynamics situate people who don't have to know as much as somebody else about circumstances because it's the default dominant perspective. It places them in advantageous positions in terms of not having to know as much as somebody else does when they're trying to counter that. So one of the pieces of advocacy for me would be to educate institutions around what's problematic. So, if you look at organizations and you say, I'm a hiring manager and I'm told that, I need to hire more equitably in terms of having representation and voice, that there should be a component in organizations that help people really understand the rationale behind that. Because, it's one thing to say, for example, tell someone that this is what you want them to do and this is what your values are as an organization, but it's another thing for them to understand. And I think that, in terms of some of the knee-jerk reaction to things that are happening globally in the world, that people want that pamphlet. They want to be able to lend, that United Nations of representation, to show that they're an organization that's striving to be more inclusive, without necessarily doing the work to create environments that people go into where they feel safe, supported, and encouraged to provide what it is they have to provide. And yeah, I think advocacy it can take multiple kind of different forms in terms of resisting the complacency that institutions have as it relates to their continuations of marginalization to non-dominant groups.
Can I add?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, as an educator, as a professor here at Mount St. Vincent University, I would say that one of the biggest ways for us to address racism is around education, of course.
Yeah.
And not just any old education, because we've obviously had schooling that have led us to where we are. We've actually probably further entrenched racism through our curriculum and through our practices. So to me, that's got to be the key thing, is analyzing what's going on, being critical of what's going on. And it's talking, I would say it's about understanding how we analyze class and power, privilege, and language. And then also thinking about the role of white supremacy. And a lot of people will say, God, white supremacy, that's just Nazism, or that's just those white supremacist people. But no, white supremacy is actually alive and it's among us now. And some people really get afraid of that terminology, but I think it's important for us to think about what is it that allows us to continually see white as best.
Yeah.
The white folks are the best to lead this province, or white folks know best about how to lead African Nova Scotians. Right? Those are the kinds of things we need to be.
I think you're getting political there.
Yes, and
so as a political science student, she could go right ahead.
It's just a great example again how white folks seem to assume that they know best for others, and that their representation is sufficient. Their lived experience is sufficient to understand what it is to live as a Black person in Nova Scotia. So again, I would really want to challenge those kinds of things. And I would say, that's the kind of thing you can talk about in a classroom. And to be afraid to talk about something political is a problem. So if you're a teacher teaching young people or children or young adults, you have an obligation as an educator to go there, go where you're a little bit uncomfortable. Be prepared to be challenged. Be prepared to share and be humble and leave your arrogance outside, and don't assume you know what your students know. Have those conversations. And if they get you in a tricky corner, or you feel like, oh gosh, the parents are going to complain because I've been talking about politics, then are you meant to be a teacher? Right? Yeah. Are you meant to be? Because we have to go into those political realms.
Yeah. So that is Perfect. We're stepping right into this next question, which asks, when is the best time, or when's a good time to have the discussion about racism? And you just talked about in the classroom. And Martin, you can jump in here, and Susie, you can jump back as well in there. Just tell us when is a good time, and you can say every time, but that's not necessarily the best time. It's a good time to have the conversation about racism.
I
Yeah.
would say, like, even with young children. So, for example, I remember being a small child and being with my mom in a store. My mom was Black. And I remember a little kid going, "Oh, look, mommy, look at that Black woman and her baby." You know, they were pointing at my mother. And my mother was so embarrassed. And this kid said, "Maybe she's Black because she drinks so much coffee." And people laughed, and even my mom laughed because everybody was so uncomfortable, and my mom couldn't get out of that store fast enough. And so that was a learning activity for me as a child. I was very young, I'd say, 4 or 5. And I remember thinking, oh, I guess we're not supposed to acknowledge the fact that my mom is Black and that everybody in this whole town is white. This is in Fredericton, back in the day when it was a very, very white city and still could be considered that way. But so I would say, if someone is acknowledging that there's a difference, don't shy away and go, "Oh, stop talking about that. Like, don't mention that." Go there, because there's this idea that if you talk about race, you must be racist. And I say, no, this is a difference that children are learning. Like that little child that was asking about my mother, that child learned that day not to acknowledge race and not to think about race, and just to pretend that that person is the same as you, which is completely wrong. They are very much different. My mom was Black, and that woman's kid was a white kid. So go there and say, okay, you know what? She is Black because of, or maybe we could even ask her, or how about we go home and we'll read a book about it, or, don't be afraid to talk about race.
I like that.
Utter blindness, isn't it?
Yes, that's a political decision a lot of people make.
And like that you spoke about that, because I remember everyone I've had this conversation with Randy before. I've had a little child. So when I came out of quarantine, I was living on campus at a different residence, and he was there for the day camp, and he goes to his friend, she's the girl next to him, "Look, a Black girl." I felt uncomfortable because where I'm from, everyone is Black.
Right.
So I've never had that happen to me. And I'm in my head, I'm like, okay, has he just never seen a Black person before? But there are quite a bit of Black people in Nova Scotia.
Right.
So I just didn't know how to feel about that. I felt uncomfortable. I was like, oh, Randy, is that racist? That's where the idea for this entire podcast stemmed from. I'm like, well, let's talk about what makes people, and what is this racist? Is that racist? Like, it's just the little things. Yeah, especially that we can't identify, coming from a background of a predominantly Black society. We have seen white people. We don't go, oh, look, it's a white man. Right. We welcome them. We teach them about our culture. We let them know what it's like to live our life. And it's the opposite here. It's like you come here and they're like, oh, look, it's a Black girl walking through our neighborhood. It's like stuff like that. So it's a bit. I guess the way that you have thought about it actually opens my mind to think, well, maybe ignorance as well as silence is what causes us to go through with that blindness. It's like, oh no, we're all the same when we're really not.
Right. And I think there's often a value attached.
Yes.
If the child said, look at that Black person, oh my gosh, run away, or that person shouldn't be here, let's call the police, versus a child who's just saying, oh, there's a Black person. So
curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity. So I think it's important to sort of understand, was there any power involved? Is there any value judgment placed on the declaration of there's a Black girl? That, to me, would help us understand if it was any racist implication to the statement.
Yeah. Well, Martin, jump in there. When's the right time to talk about racism?
So short of the answer.
No, that's not an answer.
I think strategically, I mean, you always have to recognize that racism exists and it manifests kind of in different ways all of the time. Yeah. And I think one of the ways that we need to think about talking about racism is giving context. So from an educational perspective, we can talk about the origins, the impetus, the purpose of racism historically, but always work to bring it back to relevant circumstances and situations, because when we were sitting down to have this conversation off the top, I'm like, what constitutes racism? And so I was thinking about that before I came down, and I'm like, my perception of what constitutes racism would be different than someone else's.
Absolutely.
And the dynamic of that, that's why I led with the conversation around power. I've always been in circumstances institutionally where I've had to justify the existence of racism to somebody who hasn't had a lived racialized experience like me.
Yeah.
So if I was in school, we had one black teacher through the course of my whole educational career at my school. It's a consolidated school, P to 12. And so there was the opportunity to access one person as an educator that might understand the world as I see it from in terms of interpreting racism. So what constitutes racism depends upon who you are asking about that. And the default position of many people, and the criteria was the explicit expression of something derogatory may or may not justify racism. Meaning that, well, what did this person really mean, and where did they hear it, and they didn't know what they were saying, and all the rationalization that you can kind of, rationalizations away from acknowledging that my experience, my racialized experience, requires me to encounter racism as a lived experience. And so when I think about it, I think that in terms of when is the right time, I think we have to be responsive to the reality of racism. And so if issues in terms of pushback come forward as it relates to uh, racist ideologies, we need to be prepared to organize and reconnect in terms of talking about explicitly how racism manifests and the impact that it has on us. I think we still should continue to talk about racism in times where it isn't as overt or isn't as present, with the idea of always keeping the dialogue going as it relates to the experiences that we're having, whether how severe or how innocuous they might seem. Because I think every time that we don't talk about it and we come back to that conversation, it's a shock. I thought we were post-racial. I thought, we've gotten over these things. And so I kind of answered that question in terms of being that it's always time to talk about racism, but I think the extent and degree with which we talk about racism is directly kind of connected to the experiences that we have.
That's a good answer.
In the environment.
That's a very good answer.
Thank you.
Now, I say it is a very good answer because I like the idea of being proactive. In our context, and I'll speak more specific in Guyana, for instance, we try to be proactive in many senses, and and let me use the going to the hospital here, for instance. If one of my friends went and she's 40, and she said she just went to her doctor and says, I'm 40. I need to get checked up before, things go wrong and those kinds of things. And he says, well, nothing is wrong with you. When something is wrong, come back and I'll check and we'll have you checked up. So in our context, we tend to be more proactive, whereby you get to a certain age, you're taught or certain things are told to you what to do. For me, my mom said, okay, you're getting older, you should stop playing soccer now. Your bones won't heal that quickly, right? So, or you have children, you can't continue doing these kinds of things. For racism, I approached the school and I said, nothing is happening right now. Can we use this opportunity to teach racism, to teach about how to avoid racism? And they said, well, nothing is happening. We're not going to do anything. Then something happened. And all of a sudden they said, Randy, remember 6 months ago you approached us and asked to do this workshop? Can you do this workshop? And I said, let me think about it.
Yeah.
Because I was the one that approached the school to say, you should have this training before something happened. And then I was the one that brought something to their attention to say, this is happening.
Right.
You need to act on it. And then they turn to me and say, can you help me fix it?
Yeah.
And I think that provides an insight in terms of the seriousness or the degree to which institutions take racism seriously.
Yeah.
And, speaking as a diversity manager, meaning that my previous role was orientated around working for, a school board to be responsive to issues. And so, that their understanding of your utility to the organization is rooted around what can you do for me?
Yes.
And so when there isn't an incident to respond to, there are seemingly proactive things that they want you to do, but it isn't necessarily orientated in terms of serving the community. It's generally orientated in terms of serving the center. So what can we do to create the optics of, the pamphlets and those types of things, as opposed to meaningfully working with community or on behalf of community to create levels of understanding that would avoid those things.
Yeah.
But you can be sure that when the institution and your role as a diversity manager encounters a situation, they're going to seek you out to utilize your goodwill with the community, your connection to community, to help gloss over the issue and an attempt to minimize the seriousness of the incident.
Absolutely.
Just jump in
Yeah.
about being proactive, and you mentioned schools in particular, and I'm thinking this is such an important institution when we think about how people learn about race and racism. And so I would say, first of all, probably folks who go through a Bachelor of Education program should be well versed and should spend a lot of their education in understanding oppressions,
Yes.
including race and what is racism, what is anti-Black racism, all the things that we've talked about today. And then once they're in the classroom, is trying to be critical of what curriculum is consistently being used as the norm. And if you can go through your curriculum guide and you don't see stories from Black folks, whether they're African Nova Scotians or whether they're newcomers, if you see it pretty much about white stories, then there's a problem. And that's your job as a teacher to be critical of that, to make sure that even if there's no Black child in your classroom, that you ensure there's a Black perspective offered in that classroom. Because I've heard people say, well, I don't have any Black kids, so why would I have to teach about Black issues? And you will hear people say, when it's like Black Heritage Month, oh, let's get all those Black neighbors to come in, and let's get a Black guest speaker, and let's get a Black drummer, and all of a sudden, all Black folks are all of a sudden very important, but they're just important for that little tiny time, and then boom, we're back to the norm again. So to me, it's about understanding how we systematically, continually normalize what is exclusionary of Blackness, whether it's the curriculum or the stories that we share or the authors that we resort to, or even examples, when we're talking about global geopolitics. We're often going to Russia as examples of communism, for example, when there's other countries that we can be looking at to help us understand, and they may be on the continent of Africa. Why don't we even look at Africa as examples for helping us understand politics or geopolitical issues? So on the systemic level, that's important. The other thing is on the individual level. And I'll give you an example. I was with my friend and another person came into the room and they said, oh, Jenny, I haven't seen you in a coon's age. And my friend Jenny, who's Black, said, I can't believe you just used that. And this person said, well, gee, I use it all the time. Coon? Like, what's wrong with coon? Isn't that raccoon? And my friend who's from the UK said, no, coon is a term that we use for Black folks. And it's a very derogatory term. And this person was, oh, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize. I didn't know, blah, blah, blah. And so again, this is a learning opportunity.
Yes.
And it's not to put that person on the defensive and say, you may not have known, and that's fine. Now you know from this point on. So it's taking those opportunities to have those conversations. And it's not about shaming the person because maybe they didn't know. But again, it comes back to, was this intentional or unintentional? And whether it's intentional or unintentional, the harm is still there.
Yes.
So you may say, oh, I'm so sorry, I didn't know. It doesn't give you like full right to carry on with that. You have to recognize people say things that are very painful and very hurtful. They may not even know it, but they have an obligation to learn differently from that point on.
Absolutely.
I think that's a key point, and I remember us having conversations about this in our Afrocentric cohort. But it's the question of intent versus impact, and it's about having permission, I guess, to have those conversations. And so you have to assess the right time to kind of have those conversations with, depending upon who you're encountering. So I just keep coming back to the idea of like intent versus impact. I find right now, is that, and what I'm hearing, what I was hearing from students in school was that, their friend might say something that's problematic along a racialized line, in line with what Dr. Brigham was sharing. And the defensive component of it is, well, I didn't intend that, and so therefore, because I didn't intend it, I don't care how you feel about it. And there's a dismissiveness that comes with that power to not have to experience it and be on the opposite end of racism, that people who make derogatory comments or inadvertently make derogatory comments or hurtful comments, they can hide in that intent kind of space to say, well, you're just too sensitive, and they project it onto the victim as that, well, you shouldn't be hurt by that, you're making something out of nothing. And so once again, that's that intrusion of power that prevents us from getting further into dialogue about reflecting on things and how they impact and the experiences that different people have, because it defaults to the dominant culture.
Yeah. So another, I'll just wrap. We're just wrapping up here, but what I want to point out too is that there's time to have the discussion or to talk about racism, and there's a time not to. I just shared one experience where I was trying to be proactive, and here's another experience where you should not have that conversation about racism. I think in the hallways where people are walking by and they cannot capture the whole and essence of your entire conversation. Point in case is, I did a workshop once and I asked folks to tell me something that they've heard about prejudice, that they've heard about a community. And so they were supposed to fold that up and toss it at me. And one came up about Mulgrave. The people in Mulgrave Park are lazy. So I took that one and I posted neatly a case in my desk so anyone that came to my office can read that. And just about everyone that came to my office said, "Who wrote that? Why would they even write something like that?" And people got angry. So that was just a snippet of our conversation without having context as to why that piece of information was on the paper. That angered a lot of people. Strategically, it was to have that discussion about race and our prejudice and all these kinds of things. And so, to anyone that asked about it or got angry about that piece of paper, I used it as a teaching moment. For the audience or for those who are listening, my office is always open for those kinds of discussions. Please feel free to come to Seaton 314 at any point and sit down and have that discussion about race. We're on to about 3 and we're just about ready to leave. And I appreciate this conversation that we've had. Is this racist? Yes, we've touched on many topics in many areas that signify one way or the other, but I will allow the listeners to learn from what we have discussed today, and hopefully you'll take this knowledge and pass on to your friends and family, and teach each other. We do need to have further discussion about racism. It's not something to listen to once and walk away, because it is around us at all times, and so we have to be always prepared. So again, thank you, my guest, the honored guest, for being a part of this discussion, and for the audience for being here as well. And for those who are listening, there are many more discussions to be had on the Baobab tree. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Brandy.
Thank you.